The Ozarks do not forget. The mountains hold their memories in thick roots and hollowed valleys, in winds that whistle like someone whispering a warning too late to matter. For 100 years, an empty stretch of land lay untouched at the edge of an aging town, avoided in the daylight, never spoken of after dark. People said trees wouldn't grow right there, animals wouldn't cross it, and strangers learned quickly that asking questions was not just impolite, it was dangerous. When the ground was finally broken open, when the soil was disturbed as if waking a sleeping beast, the past clawed its way back with a patience that bordered on cruelty. What they uncovered was not just evidence, not just remnants, but the echo of something deliberately hidden, something a powerful family swore would never see daylight again. Old paper crumbled in trembling hands, the handwriting still desperate, still breathing fear across a century. Doors that had been shut with prayer and threat swung open, and the town's polite silence shattered into panic, suspicion, and memory. Because secrets buried that long don't stay quiet when they rise, and this one didn't just want to be found, it wanted to be heard. The discovery of the old ledger was the spark that ignited the investigation into the Ozark family's dark past, a moment that would unravel a century of carefully buried secrets. The historian had been drawn to the region by local folklore and whispers of a family whose history seemed to vanish into the mists of the Ozark Hills, stories dismissed by most as ghost tales or exaggerations. Yet, as he stepped inside the long-abandoned cabin, he felt an unsettling weight, a sense that the walls themselves were keeping watch. Dust coated every surface, and the air smelled of decay and disuse, but amid the debris, a small, nondescript ledger caught his eye. Its leather cover was cracked and mottled, the stitching frayed, but it exuded a strange presence, as if the object itself carried a warning. When he opened it, the pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with tight, precise handwriting that seemed to snake across the margins in ways that suggested the author was documenting more than mundane affairs. At first glance, the ledger appeared to be a record of ordinary family business, expenses, land purchases, livestock, and the comings and goings of various family members. But as he turned each page, subtle anomalies began to surface. Names were crossed out, dates misaligned, and certain entries ended with cryptic symbols or shorthand that made little sense. Some of the pages were deliberately torn or stained with what appeared to be rust-colored smudges, evidence of attempts to hide or destroy portions of the record. A recurring pattern of disappearances was concealed within the ledger's numerical codes, small gaps that suggested people had vanished, sometimes for years, sometimes forever. Occasionally, marginal notes hinted at rituals, punishments, or events that were both specific and horrifyingly vague, a breadcrumb trail left behind by a hand that seemed to oscillate between confession and concealment. The historian began to feel the ledger's pull, the way it demanded attention and comprehension, its pages almost alive with a presence from another time. Each discovery seemed to deepen the mystery rather than resolve it, revealing that the family's seemingly ordinary exterior had always been a carefully maintained facade. The ledger was more than a record, it was a map of concealed horrors, a coded diary of secrets so disturbing that those who had once held it had gone to great lengths to ensure it would remain hidden. As he realized the scope of what he had found, the cabin around him seemed to close in, the shadows of the past pressing against the present, signaling that what lay within these brittle pages was only the beginning of a story that had been buried for over a century. The mysterious disappearances tied to the Ozark family began as whispers among the local communities, stories passed down through generations that no one dared fully investigate. People in the surrounding hills spoke of neighbors who simply vanished, leaving behind empty chairs at dinner tables and beds that remained untouched, as though the missing had stepped out for a moment and never returned. These disappearances were never reported formally, and over time, they became the stuff of folklore, ghost stories told around fireplaces, warnings for children to behave, and hints of something lurking beneath the veneer of normalcy. But as the historian delved deeper, cross-referencing dates, family records, and oral histories, a pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. The disappearances were not random, they seemed to follow an almost ritualistic cadence, recurring at certain times of year, often coinciding with family gatherings or obscure anniversaries that made no sense on the surface. The unsettling realization was that these gaps in family presence were never accidental. Entire branches of the family tree bore marks of sudden absence, leaving behind questions that had never been answered. Parents, siblings, and even young children disappeared with a regularity that suggested a deliberate act, not misfortune or the harsh realities of life in the remote Ozarks. The more he investigated, the more he learned that those who vanished often left traces, footprints leading nowhere, personal belongings abandoned, journals with half-written entries, but no bodies were ever found. Townsfolk recalled hearing strange noises in the night, lights flickering in abandoned cabins, and the occasional distant screams that were quickly rationalized as the wind or animals. These incidents were dismissed at the time, but in retrospect, they fit seamlessly into a terrifying pattern. What made the disappearances even more chilling was the family's uncanny ability to avoid suspicion. Outsiders rarely connected the missing to the family, and law enforcement records were scarce or conveniently lost. Stories hinted at the patriarch's influence and the family's control over local authorities and neighbors, creating a culture of silence and fear. Even within the family, whispers were carefully managed, and questions were deflected with charm or threats. Over decades, this web of secrecy grew tighter, concealing the truth beneath layers of lies, superstition, and the natural isolation of the Ozark terrain. Each disappearance was a thread in a tapestry of darkness that, when pulled, threatened to unravel the carefully maintained facade of respectability. As these missing persons stories surfaced through diaries, journals, and hushed recollections, it became clear that the family's history was not just tragic but intentionally obscured, hiding a deliberate legacy of vanishing that had persisted for generations. The discovery of strange artifacts in the Ozark family home added an entirely new layer of unease to the unfolding investigation, suggesting that the darkness hinted at in the ledger and the stories of disappearances was not merely metaphorical but tangible. Buried beneath years of dust, grime, and neglect, a rusted iron chest was uncovered in a shadowed corner of the cellar, wedged tightly between the foundation wall and a stack of rotting crates. The chest was locked, but time and corrosion had weakened its clasps, allowing them to give way with a reluctant twist. Inside, the historian found a collection of objects that immediately set his pulse racing. Small tools shaped with precision, vials containing substances that smelled faintly metallic, fragments of cloth stained in ways that were disturbingly human, and bundles of journals bound in leather, each bearing a hand-tooled insignia that matched markings seen in the ledger. The contents were not random, they were arranged methodically, as if the family had meticulously catalogued them with purpose and intent. Among the artifacts were sketches and diagrams, crude at first glance but unmistakably detailed when examined closely. Some depicted figures bound or in contorted poses, while others showed cryptic symbols and architectural layouts that hinted at hidden rooms, secret compartments, and subterranean spaces beneath the house. The materials suggested a preoccupation with secrecy, ritual, and control, evidence of practices that had likely taken place over generations without interference. The historian realized that these were not mere curiosities or antique relics, they were instruments, records, and remnants of acts that were deliberately concealed from the world. Each item seemed to whisper its own story, a faint echo of pain, obsession, and power, drawing the present into the macabre gravity of the past. The journals in particular were revelatory. They contained entries written in a mixture of prose, coded language, and symbolic notation, chronicling events that seemed simultaneously mundane and horrific. Names of family members appeared alongside dates, locations, and references to objects found in the chest itself, tying each entry to physical evidence. Some passages were confessions, others instructions, and many were cryptic warnings about outsiders discovering the truth. The historian could feel the intentionality behind every artifact. The family had not only committed unspeakable acts but had gone to painstaking lengths to preserve a record for themselves, ensuring that no detail would be lost, even if the world remained ignorant. As he examined the chest, a chilling realization took hold. These artifacts were a bridge between legend and reality. The disappearances, the ledger's coded entries, and the hushed folklore were no longer stories, they were symptoms of a deeply entrenched darkness, one that had left tangible traces to prove that the Ozark family's secrets were far more sinister than anyone had dared to imagine. Each item pulled him deeper into a history that had been carefully hidden, a puzzle whose pieces were stained with fear, obsession, and the undeniable evidence of human suffering, waiting to be understood but never fully confronted. The discovery of the forbidden room marked a turning point in the investigation, transforming the Ozark family's story from whispered legend into a tangible horror. Hidden behind a false wall in the deepest corner of the cabin's attic, the room had been meticulously concealed, its entrance so cleverly disguised that decades of occupancy or even casual exploration would have revealed nothing. The historian had stumbled upon it almost by accident, noticing subtle irregularities in the paneling and a draft that shouldn't have existed in a sealed space. With careful inspection, he discovered a narrow seam that ran along the edge of a wall, a seam that, when pressed in the right sequence, yielded to a hidden latch. As the wall swung open with a slow, creaking protest, the historian felt an immediate chill, as if the house itself was warning him to turn back. The air inside was heavy and damp, carrying the faint odor of mold, decay, and something more elusive, almost metallic, that suggested the presence of long-hidden organic matter. Inside, the room was a time capsule of the family's most disturbing practices, preserved with a level of obsessive detail that bordered on ritualistic. Shelves lined with journals, boxes filled with small instruments, and bundles of faded documents were arranged with methodical precision, each object catalogued and placed as if the family had anticipated the possibility of future discovery. The journals were particularly haunting. They chronicled the family's actions with a cold, clinical detachment, yet the entries often carried a personal tone that hinted at pride, fear, and justification. There were descriptions of ceremonies, punishments, and behaviors that modern sensibilities could barely comprehend, all carried out under the guise of tradition, secrecy, or some warped sense of morality. Marginal notes suggested that the family monitored their own lineage with an obsessive eye, ensuring that their customs, no matter how macabre, would continue unbroken. The walls themselves seemed to bear witness, adorned with faded sketches and symbols that repeated across different surfaces, forming patterns whose meaning was indecipherable to the casual observer but unmistakably deliberate. Beneath the floorboards, shallow depressions hinted at even more hidden spaces, possibly containing objects or records too sensitive to keep on open shelves. Each artifact, each scribbled page, and every etched symbol contributed to an overwhelming sense that this room had been the epicenter of the family's darkest impulses, a private theater where morality, fear, and obsession collided. Standing within the confines of that forbidden space, the historian began to understand the magnitude of what had been hidden for over a century. This was not merely a room filled with relics, it was a controlled environment in which the family had curated their own secrets, ensuring that the full extent of their darkness could remain concealed from the world. Every object, every entry, and every symbol was a deliberate act of preservation, a way of asserting dominance over the past while keeping the truth insulated from prying eyes, and yet now, the walls themselves seemed to whisper that those secrets were eager to be revealed. As the historian began piecing together the contents of the ledger, the artifacts, and the journals from the forbidden room, a sinister pattern emerged that stretched across generations, revealing a family legacy far darker than anyone had imagined. What at first appeared to be isolated incidents, disappearances, strange rituals, and coded entries now coalesced into a chilling narrative, one that suggested deliberate, systematic control over life, death, and secrecy. Each generation seemed to inherit not only the family estate but also a shadowy blueprint of behaviors and obsessions, a set of unwritten rules that dictated who could vanish, who could witness, and who must remain silent. The pattern was unmistakable. Children born under certain circumstances were marked for unknown purposes, family members who questioned authority disappeared without explanation, and every act of cruelty or concealment seemed meticulously recorded, as if each generation were documenting their own complicity in an unbroken chain of darkness. Analysis of the family tree revealed more than just names and dates. Certain branches were conspicuously sparse, with missing or altered records that hinted at deaths and vanishings that had been erased from public memory. There were recurring motifs in the ledger entries and journals, symbols, numerical codes, and references to rituals that repeated across decades, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly, signaling that the family patriarchs had established traditions that were considered too sacred or too dangerous to be exposed. Even marriages and alliances appeared to have been orchestrated to maintain control over bloodlines, property, and secrets, reinforcing the notion that the family operated not according to the normal rhythms of community life but by a private, internal logic that prioritized preservation of their hidden knowledge above all else. The more the historian delved, the more he realized that these patterns were not simply the product of eccentricity or isolation. They were methodical, almost obsessive, a framework that governed the family's actions across decades. Each disappearance, each cryptic ledger entry, and each artifact in the hidden room fit into a network of behaviors that suggested calculation and intention. The family's influence extended beyond the walls of the estate, touching neighbors, local authorities, and even casual visitors, creating a culture of fear and compliance that ensured the continuation of their practices. Understanding this pattern transformed the investigation from a study of historical oddities into a confrontation with deliberate malice and generational complicity. The darkness that had been whispered about for so long was no longer vague or abstract. It was structured, coded into the very DNA of the family's history, and carried forward like an inheritance. The realization that every detail, the vanishings, the symbols, the hidden chambers, and the meticulously kept records, was part of a broader, repeating cycle made it clear that the family's secret was not a series of isolated horrors, but a sustained, intergenerational enterprise of concealment and control, carefully constructed to survive for over 100 years. The whispers of the past that surrounded the Ozark family home were more than idle gossip. They were echoes of events so terrifying that they had embedded themselves into the collective memory of the surrounding community. Long after the family faded from public view, locals spoke of unexplainable phenomena that seemed to haunt the estate, tales that carried a weight of fear impossible to ignore. People walking near the property at dusk reported sudden chills and the feeling of being watched, shadows moving just beyond sight, and faint sounds that could not be traced to any natural source. Children playing in the nearby hollows sometimes claimed to see figures in the windows or glimpses of faces that disappeared when approached, and animals avoided the property altogether, skirting the perimeter with instinctual caution. These accounts, dismissed by many as superstition, began to take on a new significance when viewed alongside the historian's discoveries, suggesting that the house itself might bear the imprint of the horrors committed within. Folklore and oral tradition painted the family as both powerful and cursed, a lineage that could command loyalty and fear with equal measure. Tavern conversations and hushed porch discussions hinted at long-standing grudges, mysterious fires, and sudden illnesses that afflicted those who crossed the family or asked too many questions. Neighbors recalled strange lights flickering in abandoned rooms, sudden gusts of wind in perfectly still air, and inexplicable tremors that seemed localized to the estate. Each story was fragmentary, seemingly unrelated, yet when combined with the ledger, the artifacts, and the hidden rooms, a pattern emerged. The family's legacy had left a resonance in the land itself, a shadow that refused to dissipate even after generations had passed. The more the historian listened to these accounts, the more he began to see that the community's reticence to speak openly was not merely born of respect or fear of scandal. There was a deeper, almost primal recognition that the house and its former occupants had been capable of acts beyond ordinary comprehension, and that proximity to the estate could bring the past uncomfortably close. The whispers carried warnings: do not linger near the hollow at night, avoid the trail that leads to the back of the property, never speak the family's name aloud. Even seasoned locals, who had grown up hearing every ghost story in the region, approached these warnings with a seriousness that suggested they were rooted in real, enduring terror rather than simple superstition. As these stories accumulated, it became clear that the legacy of the family was not confined to historical records or physical artifacts. The land itself, the very air around the abandoned estate, seemed infused with the memory of past violence, obsession, and secrecy. The whispers were a living testament to the family's enduring influence, a chorus of unease that beckoned the historian to confront the lingering presence of a darkness that refused to remain buried, a darkness that had shaped not only the house but everyone who dared to come near it. The coded diary that emerged from the depths of the Ozark family home offered perhaps the most chilling glimpse into the mind of the patriarch, a man whose careful orchestration of secrecy had spanned decades and whose influence had shaped generations of hidden horrors. Unlike the ledger or the journals, which recorded events in a partially veiled way, this diary carried an unmistakable air of confession, though cloaked in cryptic symbols, shorthand, and deliberate misdirection. At first glance, the entries appeared nonsensical, a jumble of letters, numbers, and abstract sketches that resisted interpretation. Yet, as the historian began to cross-reference dates, locations, and recurring symbols, the diary revealed an intricate map of the family's darkest acts, a record not meant for outsiders but preserved as a testament, or perhaps a warning, by the man who had orchestrated it all. Within the diary, names of missing family members were listed alongside dates that coincided with the ledger's unexplained gaps. Marginal notes, written in a smaller, more frantic hand, hinted at rituals, punishments, and methods of concealment that were as deliberate as they were terrifying. Some passages appeared almost self-reflective, as though the patriarch was recording not only what he had done but why he had done it, rationalizing the unimaginable through appeals to tradition, necessity, or the idea of a family legacy. In one entry, he seemed to acknowledge the possibility of discovery, writing warnings in code that suggested anyone who tried to unravel the truth would face consequences, whether practical, psychological, or otherwise. The diary, in its fragmented and symbolic form, was both a confession and a shield, an object that admitted guilt while simultaneously obscuring it from all but the most determined reader. As the historian deciphered more of the diary, the extent of the patriarch's planning became horrifyingly clear. Each disappearance, each secret compartment, and each artifact found in the hidden rooms was accounted for with meticulous precision. The patriarch had documented his actions as though he were constructing a narrative that would endure beyond his lifetime, ensuring that the family's dark legacy would be traceable only to those willing or cursed to follow the clues. There was a disturbing sense of pride interwoven with fear, a recognition that the acts committed were monstrous yet executed with careful deliberation and discipline. The diary also suggested that the patriarch had viewed himself as the ultimate arbiter of morality within the family, deciding who could live, who would vanish, and who would bear the burden of silence. It became evident that the horrors were not random or impulsive, they were premeditated, calculated, and sustained across decades. In its coded pages, the diary encapsulated the family's most unsettling truths, that for generations, darkness had been curated, preserved, and celebrated in secret, and that the full weight of these actions had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally piece together the unthinkable reality. The modern-day consequences of the Ozark family's century-old secret became increasingly apparent as the historian's investigation began to intersect with the lives of living descendants, many of whom had grown up unaware of the true nature of their lineage. For generations, the family had managed to bury its past, cloaking acts of cruelty, disappearances, and ritualistic behaviors beneath layers of silence, charm, and social influence. Yet the echoes of that history were not entirely dormant. Descendants began experiencing inexplicable phenomena, objects moving seemingly on their own, sudden chills in empty rooms, and nightmares that mirrored the cryptic events recorded in the patriarch's diary and the hidden journals. Some reported feelings of being watched, an oppressive weight in certain areas of the family estate, and fleeting glimpses of shadows that did not belong to anyone present. These experiences were subtle at first, easily dismissed as imagination or coincidence, but as they multiplied, it became clear that the past had left an imprint too profound to ignore. The consequences were not limited to psychological disturbances. Long-buried documents and artifacts began surfacing in unexpected ways, sometimes in the possession of descendants who had inherited storage boxes, attics, or basements without knowledge of what they contained. Letters, journals, and small ritualistic objects emerged in homes, revealing connections to events the families had never been told about. Some descendants attempted to ignore these discoveries, fearing exposure or the stigma that would accompany acknowledgement, but the physical reality of the objects and the undeniable patterns in family records made denial impossible. The presence of these artifacts suggested that the patriarch's carefully constructed secrecy had cracks, that the measures taken to hide the family's history had not fully prevented the past from seeping into the present. Socially, the impact rippled outward as well. Descendants who lived in the surrounding communities found that neighbors and distant relatives occasionally treated them with an unease or wariness they could not explain, as though the land itself remembered the family's dark legacy. Stories from local folklore that once seemed distant now acquired immediate resonance, and interactions that might have been ordinary carried an undertone of latent fear. Even casual visitors reported an atmosphere of tension, a sense of something lurking beneath the veneer of normal life, hinting at a continuity between the past and the present. As these modern-day consequences accumulated, the historian realized that the Ozark family's secret had never truly been buried. Its influence persisted, shaping behavior, perception, and reality in subtle yet undeniable ways. The sins of the past were alive, threaded into the fabric of the present, and they demanded recognition, understanding, and reckoning. The darkness that had once been confined to ledger pages, hidden rooms, and cryptic diaries was now an active force, reminding the living that the weight of a century-long secret could never fully be escaped, and that the past's reach extended far beyond what anyone had imagined. The uncovering of the underground tunnel network beneath the Ozark family estate brought the investigation into stark, undeniable confrontation with the physical manifestation of the family's century-old secrets. These tunnels had been hinted at in the patriarch's coded diary and sketched crudely in the journals, but no one had imagined their scale or purpose. Hidden beneath the main house and extending into the surrounding hills, the passages were narrow, claustrophobic, and lined with rough-hewn stone, with certain sections reinforced by decayed timber. They had been meticulously constructed to allow movement between rooms and even between buildings without detection, and their existence suggested a premeditation and level of foresight that was both ingenious and horrifying. As investigators crawled through the darkness, the air grew damp and musty, carrying a faint, metallic scent that seemed to linger in every corner, a silent testament to what had once occurred in these subterranean spaces. Within the tunnels, the historian and a small team discovered remnants that confirmed the worst suspicions. Scattered along the passageways were human bones, some partially covered by dirt, others tucked into corners as if deliberately hidden. Small artifacts, handmade restraints, fragments of personal belongings, and tools whose function was both obscure and sinister appeared in the dim light of flashlights, each item pointing toward acts of confinement, experimentation, or ritual. The network of tunnels was more than a hiding place, it was a controlled environment where the family's most unspeakable acts had been carried out with methodical precision. The layout suggested not only concealment but also observation, with vantage points and hidden alcoves allowing someone above ground to monitor activity below, ensuring compliance, secrecy, and perhaps even enforcement of punishment or ritual. The discovery of these tunnels transformed the abstract horrors recorded in the journals into a tangible reality. What had once been whispers and coded entries were now inseparable from the physical evidence of cruelty, obsession, and concealment. The historian realized that the family had invested years, perhaps decades, into constructing this underground labyrinth, a monument to control and secrecy that allowed them to operate beyond the reach of neighbors, law enforcement, or moral scrutiny. Every twist and turn of the tunnels, every hidden alcove and reinforced corner, was a calculated decision, demonstrating the patriarch's obsessive attention to detail and his desire to maintain power over life, death, and the very truth itself. Emerging from the tunnels, the team was confronted with the full weight of the discovery. Human remains intertwined with the architecture, the diaries, and the artifacts. The past was no longer a series of enigmatic hints, it was a literal underground graveyard, a record of centuries of secrecy and deliberate concealment. The realization that the family had not only hidden their crimes in documents and folklore but had also engineered spaces specifically to conceal the physical evidence underscored the magnitude of their depravity. These tunnels were the ultimate proof of a darkness that had persisted for generations, a labyrinth that both preserved and amplified the horrors committed within, ensuring that the family's secret remained buried until now. The moment the Ozark family's century-long secret was exposed marked the culmination of generations of concealment, transforming whispered local legends into a public reckoning that rippled far beyond the hills. After decades of meticulous documentation, hidden rooms, coded diaries, and underground tunnels, the evidence could no longer be contained or dismissed. Scholars, investigators, and journalists descended on the property, drawn by the historian's painstaking reconstruction of events, and the world began to confront the staggering extent of what had been intentionally hidden. What had once been hearsay, the vanished family members, strange rituals, and unexplained phenomena now carried the weight of irrefutable proof. The community, long accustomed to silence and subtle unease, was forced to reconcile the idyllic appearance of the Ozark homestead with the atrocities that had unfolded within and beneath it. Public exposure brought an immediate and visceral reaction. Descendants, many of whom had lived their entire lives unaware of the depth of their ancestry, faced a shattering confrontation with a history that had been carefully erased from conversation and record. Some struggled with disbelief, others with shame, as the broader community grappled with the realization that the darkness had not been the product of myth or rumor but of deliberate, systematic actions carried out across generations. The media coverage amplified the sense of horror, juxtaposing images of the serene Ozark landscape with descriptions of hidden rooms, cryptic journals, underground tunnels, and human remains, creating a jarring contrast between appearance and reality. As more details emerged, it became apparent that the family's influence had extended far beyond their own household, touching neighbors, local authorities, and the fabric of the surrounding towns, all manipulated to preserve the secrecy that now lay bare. The public uncovering also forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about complicity, silence, and the nature of inherited evil. How much had neighbors known and chosen to ignore? How could generations of secrecy persist without detection? The revelations challenged assumptions about the safety of isolated communities, the reliability of folklore dismissed as superstition, and the potential for hidden darkness in families that appeared outwardly respectable. Archaeological and forensic analysis of the tunnels, artifacts, and remains provided undeniable evidence, but it was the human dimension, the descendants' confrontation with their own lineage, that left the deepest imprint, illustrating how history can linger, influence, and even haunt the present. As the story unfolded publicly, the century of concealment unraveled with a momentum that no one could halt. The Ozark family's dark legacy, once a shadow whispered about in taverns and cabins, became a documented chapter of true crime, demonstrating that evil, however deeply buried, has a way of asserting itself. Communities were forced to reckon with the reality that the past, no matter how carefully hidden, inevitably demands recognition, leaving everyone who encountered it to confront the chilling truth of what human secrecy, obsession, and depravity can produce over generations.